Lately, every morning brings a sense of anticipation, a feeling I haven't experienced in years. I find myself standing by the window, heart racing, waiting for him. At my age, one would think I should know better than to let a man half my age affect me so deeply. But here we are. It's as if something fierce has awakened within me. My name is Emily. I'm 48 years old and married to a wonderful man named Thomas. We live in a beautiful house in Maplewood, a quaint town known for its picturesque landscapes and friendly neighbors. Thomas's work often takes him out of town, leaving me alone for days at a time. It was during one of those long, quiet stretches that I first noticed the new gardener. His name is Jake. He's young, maybe 27 or 28, with a lean, muscular build that's accentuated by the way his muscles flex as he tends to the garden. There's something almost mesmerizing about watching him work. The ease with which he handles the tools and the way his skin glistens under the sun transform him into a kind of artist, sculpting the wilderness into perfect harmony. At first, I thought it was just a harmless admiration, a fleeting fancy of a bored housewife. After all, who doesn't enjoy a little eye candy now and then? But over time, I found myself lingering by the window longer, feeling the desire to be closer to him growing more than I could have imagined. Then one day on an impulse I decided to act. Thomas was out of town for work, the house was empty, and I felt a sudden surge of boldness. I waited until Jake was working on the hedges near the house, and then went downstairs and out onto the porch. "Would you like something to drink?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He turned surprised, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. They were a deep, warm hazel like autumn leaves. "No, thank you, ma'am," he said with a polite smile that revealed he was younger than I had thought. His dark hair was damp with sweat, and his cheeks were flushed from the effort. "Please call me Emily," I said, returning the smile. "I insist. It's hot out here. I don't want you fainting from heatstroke in my garden." He hesitated for a moment and then nodded. "Okay, thank you, Emily." I went into the house and poured him a glass of iced tea, my hands trembling slightly. What was I doing? This was crazy, but I couldn't stop myself. I wanted to be near him, to talk to him, to know more about him. I brought him the glass, and he drank it gratefully, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. I watched as he took a sip, and a drop trickled down his chin. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, smiling at me. "Thank you," he said, handing back the empty glass. "Just what I needed. Would you like more?" I asked, eager to prolong our conversation. He shook his head. "No, thank you. I should get back to work." I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment. "All right, but if you change your mind, let me know." It wasn't just that he was young and attractive. There was something about his gentleness, his silent respect, that drew me in. I watched as he drank the iced tea, lowering his gaze each time I looked at him directly, as if he couldn't hold my stare. I loved the way he smiled at me, almost shyly, with a genuine warmth that made my heart flutter. I cherished that connection and went back inside, my mind racing, feeling like an excited and nervous teenager. It was a sensation I hadn't felt in decades, and it was intoxicating. From that day on, it became a small ritual. Whenever Thomas was away, I would offer Jake a drink or a snack, and we would chat. He shared his love for gardening, something he had learned from his grandmother, while I told stories of my youth, travels, and dreams that now seemed like distant memories. Everything seemed so innocent and friendly, yet there was an underlying tension, a latent desire bubbling just beneath the surface. One night, after one of our chats, I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My eyes sparkled in a way they hadn't in years, and my cheeks were flushed. I felt alive, energized by the possibility that maybe this young man saw me as something more than a kind lady offering iced tea. But I knew it was wrong. I was married, for goodness sake. I had children, a life, a reputation to protect. And he was so young. It was ridiculous, crazy. But I couldn't stop myself. I felt attracted to him, drawn to his charm. Then Thomas returned from his business trip, and everything changed. Jake still came to tend the garden, but I couldn't invite him in anymore. I had to content myself with watching him from a distance, my heart aching with the desire I didn't want to admit. After a month of waiting for Thomas to leave again, I discovered that his schedule had changed, and he was now spending more time at home. My frustration grew. I missed those small moments of connection with Jake, the way his eyes lit up when he saw me, the thrill of imagining what might happen if I pushed the boundaries a little more. My husband showed no signs of leaving the city again. His work kept him firmly rooted in Maplewood. I found myself restless, anxious, desperate for another chance to be alone with Jake. I watched him every morning from the window, and my desire grew with each passing day. I caught myself daydreaming about him, the way he moved, the sound of his laugh, the kindness in his gaze. One morning, as I watched him from the window, my heart sank when I noticed a look of disappointment in his eyes. He glanced at the house, letting his gaze linger for a moment before returning to his work. He must have thought I had lost interest, that I no longer cared. That thought broke something inside me. I couldn't let him think that. I had his number written on a piece of paper hidden in my jewelry box. He had given it to me one afternoon, after I mentioned a rare plant in my garden that required special care. "If you ever need help with it, just call me," he had said. I knew it was just an excuse, a way to keep us connected now that our lunches had come to an end. I clung to that small piece of him like a lifeline. Soon, I realized that waiting for my husband to go on another trip was futile. He was here to stay, and I felt increasingly desperate. I needed to see Jake, to be with him. I couldn't wait any longer. One night, as I lay in bed next to my snoring husband, I made a decision. I slipped out of bed, my hands trembling as I dialed Jake's number. "Hello." Jake's voice was heavy with sleep, a mix of confusion and concern. "Jake, it's Emily," I whispered. "I hope I'm not bothering you. Is everything all right?" I gathered all the courage I had left and murmured, "I was wondering if we could meet. I think I'm going crazy, but I can't stop thinking about you." There was a long pause before he finally spoke. "Okay, I'll be there soon." I hung up the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I went to the guest room and pulled out a dress I hadn't worn in years, a soft, flowing fabric that flattered me. I looked at myself in the mirror, adjusting my hair and smoothing out imaginary wrinkles. I wasn't a young woman, but I still had something to offer. I kept myself in shape, practiced yoga regularly, and wasn't ashamed of how I looked. Not tonight. When the doorbell rang, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door to find Jake standing there, looking nervous and a bit disheveled. He wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly tousled from sleep. "Come in," I whispered, stepping aside to let him in. He hesitated, looking around as if expecting someone to jump out and catch him. "It's okay," I reassured him. "My husband is asleep. We won't wake him." He nodded slowly and stepped inside, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. I led him to the guest room, where he stood awkwardly by the door, his hands in his pockets. "Emily," he began, his voice soft. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, feeling my nerves surge again. This wasn't like offering him iced tea in the garden. This was something completely different. I took a step toward him, and he tensed, looking down. "I just wanted to see you," I said softly. "It's been so long since we talked, and I missed you." His eyes lifted to meet mine, and I saw confusion there, uncertainty. But there was something more. Curiosity, perhaps, or a reflection of my own desire. "I missed you too," he admitted, his voice barely audible. His words sent a warm shiver through my body, and I took another step forward. Now I was close enough to see the fine lines of stubble on his jaw, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. "Jake," I murmured, reaching out to touch his arm. He startled slightly but didn't pull away. "You're such a kind and sweet young man. You've made my days so much brighter just by being around." He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on my hand as it rested on his arm. "I'm just doing my job, Mrs. Emily." "Jake," I whispered, "have you ever been with a woman before?" His eyes widened, and I saw the answer on his face before he even spoke. He shifted uncomfortably, his cheeks flushing deeply. The expression in his eyes was one I hadn't seen in a long time, a mix of vulnerability and raw honesty. "No, I mean Emily," he stammered, looking down at the floor. "No, not really." Something inside me softened, a sweet and painful sensation spreading through my chest. So young, so inexperienced, and there I was, standing before him like a temptress out of a fairy tale, offering him something he probably hadn't even dared to dream of. "Jake," I murmured, "are you nervous? I just want you to feel comfortable. If you want to go, I'll understand." He swallowed hard, his throat moving visibly, but instead of backing away, he slowly shook his head. "No, I don't want to go," he whispered, his voice barely a murmur. "I don't know exactly what I'm doing, but I don't want to go." My heart leaped. I gave him a soft, reassuring smile and took a small step back, giving him a little more space. I could feel his nerves, how his body was tense, as if expecting something unexpected. He looked so out of place in that softly lit room, like a lost boy instead of the strong and capable man I had admired for weeks. "Let's just sit and talk for a bit, okay?" I suggested gently, gesturing to the small sofa by the window. "We don't have to rush into anything. I just want to get to know you better." He nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. We moved to the sofa, and I sat first, smoothing my dress over my knees. He followed, sitting on the edge of the cushion, his posture rigid. "So tell me," I began softly, turning to face him. As we talked, I could see the tension slowly leaving his body. His shoulders relaxed, and his smile became more genuine. There was a sparkle in his eyes, a light that hadn't been there before. As the conversation eased, I noticed how his gaze would drift to me, to the neckline of my dress, then quickly look away, his cheeks flushing. "Jake," I said softly, drawing his gaze back to mine. "Do you find me attractive?" The question hung heavy in the air, laden with unspoken implications. He looked at me, his eyes wide, reflecting a mix of surprise and incredulity. He struggled to find the words, his throat working furiously in an attempt to form a coherent response. Finally, he gave up and nodded, his face flushing. "Yes," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Yes, I do." A warm, pleasant heat spread through me at his confession, and I felt a sudden surge of boldness. I leaned in a little closer, grateful as his fingers, calloused and strong, found mine. "Jake," he paused, his eyes searching for something in mine, reassurance, permission. I wasn't sure. "No, Jake," I said softly. "You're not doing anything wrong. I just want you to feel good." His gaze focused on our hands, and I watched as his fingers wrapped around mine, as if holding on for dear life. I had never experienced anything like this before. The raw vulnerability in his voice surprised me, and I felt a pang of something deep and unfamiliar. It wasn't just an older woman seeking a younger man. It was clear that my presence was vital, and in that instant, I understood that perhaps he needed me as much as I needed him. I leaned in a little closer, feeling that palpable connection between us. He stayed still, holding his breath, but then slowly he began to respond. I pulled back slightly, making sure everything was okay. "This," I murmured, my eyes dark with a mystery I couldn't fully understand. "Yes," he breathed. "Please don't stop." So I decided not to. He trembled, his hands moving uncertainly at his sides before finally, cautiously, he wrapped his arms around me. Time seemed to stand still, each second stretching into eternity as we explored each other. I wondered if he had ever looked at me this way. I lifted a hand to brush a lock of hair from his forehead, and whispered that I did because I wanted to show him. He looked at me with shy timidity, and then with a slow and deliberate nod he whispered, "I want that too." With a smile, I took his hand and led him to the guest room bed. It was almost surreal, the way everything seemed suspended in time. He looked down at me, uncertainty battling with eagerness in his eyes. "It's okay, Jake," I whispered, keeping my voice calm and reassuring. "Have you done this before?" I asked softly, not wanting to overwhelm him. He seemed so much more vulnerable now, standing here in my guest room. He shook his head slowly, a melancholic smile playing on his lips. "No, not like this." His gaze burned as it met mine. And then, as if an invisible barrier had finally been broken, I saw him calmly, taking my time to help him ease into the moment. He watched me with wide, trusting eyes. There was a sweetness in his hesitation, a tenderness that made me want to hold him and assure him that everything would be all right. "Just follow my lead," I murmured. We moved together slowly, exploring and learning each other's rhythms. The entire experience felt like a new discovery, a secret shared only between the two of us. He learned quickly, his confidence growing with each small success, and when he finally let go, when he gave in to the emotions overwhelming him, it was like watching a dam break. The uncertainty vanished, replaced by something intense and overwhelming. "Emily," he whispered, his voice hoarse and filled with wonder. "I never thought." "Neither did I whispered back. "But here we are." The night stretched on, each moment blending into the next. We lost ourselves in each other, our movements slow and deliberate. When it was finally over, when we lay side by side, I felt a strange sense of fulfillment. I turned my head to look at him, and my chest tightened at the sight of his flushed face and the satisfied smile curving his lips. But as much as I wanted to stay in that moment, reality began to set in. The clock on the nightstand told me it was late, dangerously late. I couldn't risk my husband waking up and finding someone here. As much as I cared for Jake, as much as I wanted to savor this new connection, I knew we had to be careful. With a resigned sigh, I propped myself up on one elbow to look at him. I think you should go, I said softly. This isn't goodbye. We'll meet again, just not right now. I have to be careful. He looked at me intensely. After a prolonged moment, a slight smile of resignation appeared on his face. I understand, he said softly. We untangled ourselves slowly, and when he was ready, I led him to the back door, walking with light, silent steps. He turned to me one last time, his eyes filled with words he didn't dare speak. Thank you, Emily, he whispered, his voice laden with emotion. I smiled softly. No, Jake. Thank you for making me feel alive again, I said as I gently nudged him toward the door. I watched him disappear into the darkness and closed the door carefully behind him. As I stood there, my mind buzzed with a mix of emotions, guilt, relief, excitement. But there was also a strange calm settling over me. For the first time in years, I felt a renewed energy and purpose. It was as if a part of me that had been asleep was now awake. It was wrong, of course, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction I felt. With silent steps, I returned to the bedroom and slipped under the sheets next to my husband. He was still deeply asleep, his face calm and untroubled. I looked at him, and a familiar feeling of affection settled over me. But now it felt different, distant, almost detached. I still cared for him deeply, but that night, I had given a part of myself to someone else. I turned to my side, looking up at the ceiling. The house was wrapped in silence, but my mind was far from quiet. Thoughts of Jake played on a loop in my head. His tenderness, his insecurity, his enthusiasm. Curling up under the sheets, I closed my eyes and let the emotions wash over me. I knew what I had done was a betrayal, a secret I would have to carry alone. But I also knew that, in some inexplicable way, it had made me feel more connected to myself than I had been in a very long time. With a soft sigh, I let myself drift off to sleep, a small smile playing on my lips. I didn't know what the future held, or if I would ever dare to cross paths with Jake in that way again. But for now, I was content. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of life ignite within me, and that for better or for worse was enough. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of both dread and excitement. The events of the previous night felt like a dream, but the memories were vivid and real. I got out of bed, careful not to wake Thomas, and went about my morning routine with a strange mix of guilt and exhilaration. As I stood by the window, sipping my coffee, I couldn't help but look out at the garden, hoping to catch a glimpse of Jake. Thomas left for work early, as usual, and I found myself alone in the house once again. The silence was deafening, and my thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. I decided to keep myself busy, cleaning the house and tending to some indoor plants. But my mind kept drifting back to Jake. I wondered what he was thinking, how he was feeling after last night. Around noon, I heard the familiar sound of the gardening tools outside. My heart raced as I peeked through the window to see Jake working in the garden. He looked focused, his movements precise and methodical. I watched him for a moment, admiring his dedication and the way he handled the tools with such ease. I decided to go outside, unable to resist the urge to be near him. I grabbed a glass of iced tea and walked out to the porch. Jake looked up as I approached, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Good morning, Emily," he said, his voice soft and gentle. "Good morning, Jake," I replied, handing him the glass. "I thought you might need this. It's getting hot out here." He took the glass, his fingers brushing against mine briefly. "Thank you," he said, taking a sip. "You didn't have to. I wanted to," I said, sitting down on the porch steps. "How are you today?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm good. Just thinking about last night." I nodded, understanding his hesitation. "Me too. It was intense." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "Was it okay?" I mean, did I do everything right? I smiled reassuringly. Yes, Jake. You were perfect. It was a beautiful experience for both of us. He let out a sigh of relief. I'm glad. I was worried I might have done something wrong. Not at all, I said, reaching out to touch his arm gently. You were wonderful. We sat in silence for a moment, the tension between us palpable. I could feel the connection we shared, the unspoken bond that had formed between us. It was a dangerous game we were playing, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Jake, I began, my voice soft. I want to see you again. Like last night. He looked at me, his eyes wide with surprise and desire. Are you sure? I mean, what about your husband? I sighed, knowing the risks involved. I know it's complicated, but I can't deny what I feel. I need to be with you again. He nodded, a determined look in his eyes. I want that too. But we have to be careful. We will be, I assured him. We'll find a way to make it work. Over the next few days, we fell into a secret routine. Whenever Thomas was out of town, Jake would come over late at night, and we would spend hours together, exploring each other's bodies and souls. Each encounter was more intense than the last, and I found myself falling deeper into this forbidden love. One evening, as we lay entwined in each other's arms, Jake looked at me with a mixture of adoration and concern. Emily, what are we doing? Where is this going? I took a deep breath, knowing I owed him an honest answer. I don't know, Jake. All I know is that I can't stop thinking about you, and I can't imagine not having you in my life. He nodded, understanding the complexity of our situation. I feel the same way, but we have to be realistic. You're married and I'm just the gardener. I cupped his face in my hands, looking into his eyes. You're so much more than that to me, Jake. You've awakened something inside me that I thought was long gone. You make me feel alive. He smiled, his eyes filled with emotion. And you make me feel like I matter, like I'm not just some kid trying to figure out life. We kissed softly, sealing our unspoken promise to each other. We knew the risks, the potential consequences, but we couldn't deny the connection we shared. It was a dangerous dance, but one we were both willing to take. As the days turned into weeks, our secret meetings became more frequent and more intense. We found ways to communicate discreetly, using hidden notes and coded messages. Jake would leave small tokens in the garden, little signs that only I would understand. It became our own private language, a secret world that belonged only to us. One afternoon, as I was tending to the roses, I found a small, delicate flower tucked between the petals. It was a symbol of our love, a reminder of the passion we shared. I picked it up, holding it close to my heart, feeling a mix of joy and sadness. I knew that our time together was precious and fleeting, but I couldn't bring myself to let go. Thomas, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the changes in our relationship. He was too consumed by his work, too distant to notice the subtle shifts in my behavior. I felt a pang of guilt every time I looked at him, knowing that I was betraying his trust. But the pull towards Jake was too strong to resist. One evening, as Thomas and I sat down for dinner, he looked at me with a curious expression. You seem different lately, Emily. Is everything all right? I forced a smile, trying to hide my nerves. Yes, everything's fine. Just been feeling a bit restless, I guess. He nodded, accepting my explanation without question. Well, if there's anything you need, just let me know. I felt a wave of guilt wash over me, but I pushed it aside, focusing on the present moment. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. The connection I shared with Jake was too powerful, too all-consuming. As the seasons changed, so did our relationship. We found ways to steal moments together, even when Thomas was home. Jake would come over under the pretense of working in the garden, and we would find secret places to meet, hidden from prying eyes. It was a dangerous game, but one we were both willing to play. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves turned golden and the air grew cooler, Jake and I sat on a bench in the garden, hidden from view by the tall hedges. He held my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on my palm. Emily, I've been thinking, he began, his voice soft. About us, about our future. I looked at him, my heart racing. What about it? He took a deep breath, his eyes filled with determination. I want to be with you, Emily. Really be with you. Not just in secret meetings and stolen moments. As I looked into Jake's determined eyes, I felt a mix of exhilaration and fear. The thought of a future together was both thrilling and terrifying. I knew the risks, the potential consequences, but I also knew that I couldn't deny the love I felt for him. Our connection was undeniable, a force that had grown stronger with each stolen moment. As the autumn breeze rustled the leaves around us, I took a deep breath and made a decision. I would find a way to be with Jake, no matter what it took. Our love story was far from simple, but it was ours, and I was willing to face whatever challenges lay ahead to make it work. With a soft smile, I squeezed his hand, sealing our unspoken promise to each other. Together, we would navigate the complexities of our situation, guided by the love that had brought us together.